The dusty streets of Broken Creek, Texas, had seen countless drifters pass through over the years, but none quite like the man who rode into town on that sweltering August afternoon in 1879. He was tall and lean, with prematurely gray hair that caught the harsh sunlight, and eyes the color of storm clouds that seemed to hold secrets he had no intention of sharing. His clothes were well-made but travel-worn, suggesting a man of some means who had been on the road for considerable time. Most telling of all was the way he carried himself, alert but not nervous, confident but not arrogant, like someone who had learned to read danger in every shadow. Thomas Hartwell dismounted at the hitching post outside Murphy's General Store, his movements deliberate and economical. The townspeople who noticed his arrival would later remember how he seemed to take in every detail of Broken Creek, with a single glance, his eyes lingering on the sheriff's office, the bank, the saloon, and the various businesses that comprised the town's modest commercial district. But what drew the most attention was the obvious quality of his gear. The silver-trimmed saddle, the fine leather saddlebags, and especially the Colt .45 that rode low on his hip, with the easy familiarity of a man who knew how to use it. Inside Murphy's store, Thomas made small purchases: coffee, hardtack, ammunition, speaking little but listening carefully to the conversations around him. The store owner, Sean Murphy, was a talkative Irishman who served as the town's unofficial source of news and gossip. "Passing through, are you?" Murphy asked while tallying the stranger's purchases. "Most folks do. Not much to keep a man in Broken Creek unless he's got business with the cattle ranches or the oil speculation that's been going on south of here." Thomas paid for his supplies with a $20 gold piece, causing Murphy's eyebrows to rise slightly. Men carrying that kind of money usually had a story worth knowing, but the stranger's manner discouraged questions. "Just looking for some information," Thomas said quietly. "I heard there might be someone in town who knows about the old Spanish trails through this area." "Historical interest, you might say." Murphy scratched his chin thoughtfully. "Well now, if it's old trails you're wanting to know about, you'd best talk to old Maria. She's been in these parts longer than anyone. Knows stories that go back generations." Old Maria Esperanza lived in a small adobe house on the edge of town, where the buildings gave way to mesquite and prairie grass. She was a woman of indeterminate age, her face lined with decades of Texas sun and wind, her heritage a mixture of Mexican and Comanche that gave her a unique perspective on the region's layered history. Most townspeople respected her but kept their distance, unsure what to make of her knowledge of herb medicines and her occasional prophetic utterances that had an unsettling tendency to prove accurate. When Thomas knocked on her weathered wooden door that evening, Maria opened it as if she had been expecting him. Her dark eyes, still sharp despite her age, studied him with an intensity that made him slightly uncomfortable. "You're the one asking about the old trails," she said without preamble, her English accented but precise. "Come in, we have things to discuss." Thomas followed her into the small, dim interior, noting the bundles of dried herbs hanging from the ceiling and the collection of old maps and documents that covered one wall. "You're not the first to come looking," Maria said as she poured coffee from a pot that had been simmering on her small stove. "Every few years someone shows up asking about the Spanish gold trails, the lost missions, the hidden treasures. Most of them are fools chasing legends. But you're different." She handed him the cup and fixed him with a stare that seemed to see straight through to his soul. "You already know something. The question is how much?" Thomas sipped the strong coffee, choosing his words carefully. "I know that Captain Vicente Morales led an expedition through this area in 1758, carrying a significant amount of gold and silver from the missions to the south. I know that his party was attacked by Comanche raiders and that Morales and most of his men were killed. What I don't know is what happened to the treasure they were carrying." Maria nodded slowly, as if confirming details of a story she had heard many times before. "My great-grandmother was there," Maria said quietly. "She was young then, part of the Comanche band that attacked the Spanish soldiers. She used to tell me the story when I was small. The soldiers fought bravely, but they were outnumbered and far from help. But before he died, Captain Morales did something clever. He gave the treasure map to one of his men, a young soldier named Diego, and told him to hide the gold where no one would think to look for it." Thomas leaned forward, his interest clearly piqued. "Did this Diego survive? Did he hide the treasure?" Maria smiled slightly, the expression holding both sadness and secrets. "Oh, he survived. My great-grandmother saw him escape during the battle, but the Comanche caught him 2 days later. Before they killed him, he told them he had hidden the Spanish gold where the earth bleeds and the dead water flows. They thought he was delirious from his wounds, speaking nonsense. But my great-grandmother remembered the words. The old woman stood and moved to her collection of maps, selecting a piece of yellowed parchment that looked far older than anything Thomas had expected to see in a frontier cabin. "This came to me through my family," Maria said, unrolling the document carefully. "Diego drew it before he died, scratched it on a piece of leather with a burned stick. It shows where he hid Captain Morales' treasure. The problem is no one has ever been able to figure out what his clues mean." Thomas studied the crude map with growing excitement. It showed what appeared to be geographical features, hills, a creek, some kind of rock formation, but the notations were cryptic, written in a mixture of Spanish and symbols he didn't recognize. At the bottom, in faded ink, were the words Diego had spoken before his death. "Donde la tierra sangra y el agua muerta fluye," where the earth bleeds and the dead water flows. "Why are you showing me this?" Thomas asked, though he was already committing every detail of the map to memory. "Why not search for the treasure yourself?" Maria rolled up the parchment carefully before answering. "Because I'm an old woman with little time left, and I've seen what the lure of gold does to men. It corrupts them, drives them mad, turns them into something less than human. But you have the look of a man who's already been corrupted by something. Maybe gold won't make you any worse than you already are." Her words stung because they carried more truth than Thomas cared to admit. He had come to Texas running from his past, from a life in Kansas where his reputation as a detective had been destroyed by accusations of corruption and evidence tampering. The treasure represented more than wealth to him. It represented a chance to disappear completely, to reinvent himself somewhere far from the shadows that pursued him. "I'll pay you for the map," Thomas offered. But Maria shook her head. "No payment. But I have conditions. First, if you find the treasure, you leave half of it buried where Diego put it. The dead deserve their peace. Second, you tell no one about this map or where you got it. The people of this town don't need gold fever destroying what little peace they've managed to build. And third," her voice grew serious, "you be very careful. My dreams have been troubled since you arrived in town. I see danger following you, death riding in your shadow." Thomas agreed to her conditions, though he had no intention of leaving any treasure behind if he found it. As he prepared to leave, Maria gave him one final warning. "The map will lead you to what you seek, but remember that some treasures come with a price higher than their value. Diego's ghost has never rested easy, and the land itself remembers the blood that was spilled there. You may find more than you bargained for." Walking back to the hotel where he had taken a room, Thomas felt the weight of destiny settling on his shoulders. In his saddlebags now rested a careful copy of the ancient map, drawn from memory but accurate in every detail. 3 days, he decided. He would spend 3 days studying the map, gathering supplies and planning his search. Then he would disappear into the Texas wilderness to claim a treasure that had been lost for over a century. He had no way of knowing that Maria's troubled dreams were more prophetic than either of them imagined, or that his search for Diego's gold would lead him to a fate far stranger than the simple death or fortune he anticipated. The map was real. The treasure existed, but the price of claiming it would prove to be more than any man should be willing to pay. Thomas spent his first full day in Broken Creek, methodically studying the map and researching the local geography. He visited the county clerk's office, examining survey records and geological reports under the pretense of considering land purchases. The clerk, a helpful young man named Billy Morrison, was eager to share his knowledge of the area and unwittingly provided valuable information about local landmarks and terrain features. "That area south of town, where you're asking about, it's rough country," Billy explained, spreading out a contemporary survey map. "Lots of arroyos and mesas, some natural springs, but also plenty of dry creek beds that only run during heavy rains. The Comanche used to camp there regularly before they were moved to the reservation. Still find arrowheads and pottery shards if you know where to look." Thomas compared the modern map with his copy of Diego's directions, beginning to see patterns in the cryptic symbols. What he had initially taken for random marks started to resolve into a coherent route through the Badlands, south of Broken Creek. The phrase, "where the earth bleeds," began to make sense when Billy mentioned the red clay deposits that stained the ground in certain areas. and dead water flows could refer to the seasonal streams that appeared and vanished with the rains. His second day was spent gathering supplies and equipment. Thomas purchased camping gear, food for a week's journey, additional ammunition, and most importantly, a sturdy shovel and pickaxe from the hardware store. He also bought a reliable pack horse from the livery stable, telling the owner he planned to do some prospecting in the hills. The story was plausible enough that no one questioned his preparations. That evening, Thomas returned to Maria's house to clarify some details about the map. He found the old woman tending a small garden behind her adobe home, her movements slow but purposeful as she gathered herbs in the fading light. "You've decided to go," she said without looking up. "I can see it in the way you carry yourself. The map has gotten into your blood already." "I have some questions about the landmarks," Thomas said, showing her his copy of the diagram. "This symbol here near what I think is a creek bed, I can't make sense of it." Maria glanced at the drawing and pointed to a mark that resembled a twisted tree. "That's the hanging oak. There's only one tree like it in that whole area. An old oak that was struck by lightning years ago. Half of it died, but half kept growing. So it looks like it's reaching up with one arm while the other hangs down like a man on a rope." She provided similar clarifications for other symbols, gradually filling in the gaps in Thomas's understanding. But as they talked, Maria's demeanor grew increasingly troubled. "My dreams were worse last night," she admitted. "I saw you standing in a place of bones with shadows moving around you that weren't cast by any living thing. I saw gold, yes, but I also saw something else. Something that shouldn't be disturbed." Thomas dismissed her concerns as superstition, though her words sent an uncomfortable chill down his spine. "I appreciate your worry, but I'm not afraid of ghosts or curses. I've faced worse things than shadows." Maria studied his face in the gathering darkness. "Have you? Have you really? Because the things that wait in that place have been there longer than white men have walked this land. They were old when Diego buried the gold, and they'll be old when the last star burns out." Despite her warnings, Thomas was committed to his course. The next morning, he loaded his pack horse and rode out of Broken Creek just after dawn, telling anyone who asked that he would be back in a week or so. The truth was, he had no intention of returning to the small Texas town. Once he found the treasure, he would head west to California or north to Colorado, somewhere he could start fresh with enough money to live comfortably for the rest of his life. The ride south took him through increasingly desolate country. The well-maintained road gave way to cattle trails, then to game paths, and finally to open prairie where he had to navigate by compass and landmark. By midday, he could see the red mesas and broken country that matched the terrain shown on Diego's map. The similarity was remarkable, as if the Spanish soldier had possessed an artist's eye for capturing the essential character of the landscape. Thomas made his first camp near a natural spring that bubbled up from red-stained rocks, creating a small pool of clear water surrounded by mineral deposits that painted the earth in shades of rust and ochre. It was easy to see how this place might have inspired the phrase, "where the earth bleeds." The water was good, and there was grass for the horses, but something about the location made Thomas uneasy. The silence was too complete even for the wilderness. No birds sang, no insects buzzed, and even the wind seemed muted. That night, camping under a canopy of stars brighter than any he had seen in years, Thomas studied the map by firelight and planned his route for the following day. According to Diego's drawings, the hanging oak should be visible from this spring, and from there the final approach to the treasure site would become clear. But as he examined the ancient leather document, Thomas began to notice details he had missed before. There were additional markings around the edges of the map, symbols that didn't seem to represent geographical features. Some looked like animals. Others resembled human figures, and still others were completely abstract. As the fire burned lower and shadows danced across the parchment, these peripheral drawings seemed to move and shift, creating the illusion of a story being told in pictures around the border of the treasure map. Thomas convinced himself it was a trick of the firelight and his own tired eyes, but sleep came slowly that night. His dreams were filled with images of Spanish soldiers fighting for their lives, of Comanche warriors on painted horses, and of something else, something that watched from the shadows, with eyes that glowed like coals. He woke several times with the feeling that he was being observed, but each time he checked the perimeter of his camp, he found nothing but empty darkness. Morning brought relief from the oppressive atmosphere of the night, and Thomas set out early to locate the hanging oak. He found it within an hour, exactly where the map indicated it should be. The tree was even more distinctive than Maria had described, a massive oak that had been split down the middle by some ancient lightning strike. One half had died and now hung like a skeletal arm reaching toward the ground, while the other half flourished with green leaves that rustled in the morning breeze. From the hanging oak, the final landmarks became visible. A series of red cliffs formed a natural amphitheater about 2 miles to the west, and in the center of this formation, Thomas could see what appeared to be a dark opening, possibly a cave or deep recess in the rock face. According to the map, this was where Diego had hidden Captain Morales's treasure, in the place where the dead water flows. As Thomas rode toward the cliffs, he noticed that the landscape became increasingly barren. Plants were sparse and stunted. The grass grew in patches, and even the hardy mesquite trees seemed reluctant to take root. The red stone formations loomed larger as he approached, and he could see that they formed a natural bowl perhaps 100 yards across, with steep walls on 3 sides and a narrow entrance from the east. Entering this natural amphitheater was like stepping into another world. The air was noticeably cooler and sound behaved strangely, echoing off the rock walls in unexpected ways. At the center of the formation was indeed a cave opening, dark as a doorway to hell, with what appeared to be the remnants of an ancient stream bed leading into it. This had to be the dead water referenced in Diego's final words, a waterway that had once flowed but now lay dry and lifeless. Thomas dismounted and approached the cave entrance cautiously. The opening was large enough for a man to enter upright, and cool air flowed from within, suggesting it extended deep into the cliff, but there was something else in that air current, a smell he couldn't quite identify. It was organic but not entirely unpleasant, like earth and old leaves mixed with something metallic. Taking a burning branch from his campfire as a torch, Thomas entered the cave. The passage went straight back into the rock for about 50 feet, then opened into a larger chamber. And there, scattered across the floor of the cavern, were the bones of Spanish soldiers, their armor and weapons still intact after more than a century in the dry cave air. Captain Morales and his men hadn't died in the attack after all. They had made it this far only to meet their end in this hidden place. But it was what lay beyond the bones that made Thomas's heart race. Stacked against the far wall of the cave were wooden chests, their metal fittings green with age but still solid. Diego had indeed hidden the treasure here, and it had waited undisturbed for over 100 years. Thomas had found Captain Morales's lost gold, but as he moved deeper into the cave toward the chests, he began to understand that he was not alone in this place of the dead. Something moved in the shadows beyond his torchlight, something that should not have been there, something that had been waiting a very long time for someone foolish enough to disturb the rest of the dead. Thomas approached the treasure chests with mounting excitement, his torch casting dancing shadows across the cave walls and the skeletal remains of the Spanish soldiers. The chests were smaller than he had expected, but they were clearly heavy, judging by how they had settled into the cave floor over the decades. The wood was dark with age but still solid, reinforced with iron bands that had turned green with oxidation but remained intact. The first chest he opened took his breath away. It was filled nearly to the brim with gold coins, Spanish reals and doubloons that gleamed in the torchlight like captured sunshine. The second chest contained silver pieces, ingots, and religious artifacts, including a golden crucifix studded with emeralds that must have been worth a fortune in itself. The third and smallest chest held what appeared to be documents wrapped in oiled leather, along with more gold coins and several pieces of ornate jewelry. Thomas estimated he was looking at a treasure worth at least $50,000, possibly much more depending on the historical value of the artifacts. It was more wealth than he had dreamed possible, enough to set him up for life anywhere in the world. But as he knelt beside the chests, examining their contents by torchlight, he became increasingly aware that something was wrong with the cave. The temperature seemed to be dropping, though that might have been expected in an underground chamber. More disturbing was the way his torch flame began to flicker and dance, as if invisible hands were stirring the air around him, and there were sounds subtle at first but growing more distinct, like whispers in a language he didn't recognize or the soft scraping of bone against stone. Thomas tried to tell himself it was just his imagination, heightened by the eerie surroundings and the presence of so many dead soldiers. But when he turned to examine the skeletal remains more closely, he discovered something that chilled him to the bone. The skeletons were not lying in natural positions. as if the men had simply died and fallen where they stood. Instead, they were arranged in a rough circle around the treasure chests, their empty eye sockets all facing inward toward the gold and silver. More unsettling still, the bones showed signs of having been disturbed and rearranged multiple times over the years. Scratch marks in the cave floor suggested the skeletons had been moved, positioned and repositioned by someone or something that wanted them to maintain their eternal vigil over the treasure. But who could have done this? The cave showed no signs of recent human occupation, and the entrance had been concealed by brush and fallen rocks. As Thomas pondered these mysteries, his torch began to burn lower. He had brought additional materials to make more torches, but the strange behavior of the flame made him reluctant to rely on fire for illumination. Instead, he decided to work quickly, loading the most valuable items into his saddlebags before the light failed completely. He could always return for the rest once he had moved the initial treasure to safety. But as he began transferring gold coins from the chests to his bags, the whispers in the darkness grew louder and more distinct. They seemed to be coming from all around him, echoing off the cave walls in a way that made it impossible to determine their source. And gradually, Thomas began to realize that the voices were speaking Spanish, words he could almost but not quite understand. No. Debe ser molestado, came the ghostly whispers, growing clearer as his ears adjusted to their rhythm. El oro es maldito. Los muertos no descansan. The voices were telling him not to disturb something, warning that the gold was cursed, that the dead would not rest. Thomas felt his skin crawl, but greed overcame his fear. Ghosts or no ghosts, he wasn't leaving $50,000 in this cave. As he continued loading his saddlebags, the temperature in the cave dropped further, and his breath began to form visible clouds in the torchlight. The whispers grew more urgent, and Thomas could swear he saw movement in his peripheral vision, shadows that moved independently of the flickering flame. But when he turned to look directly, there was nothing there but empty darkness and the gleaming bones of long-dead soldiers. It was when he reached for the golden crucifix that things took a turn toward the genuinely terrifying. The moment his fingers touched the religious artifact, the cave was filled with a sound like a great wind rushing through underground passages, though no air stirred. The torchlight flickered wildly, and in that strobing illumination Thomas saw something that made his blood freeze in his veins. The skeletal soldiers were moving, not dramatically, not rising to their feet like something from a penny dreadful, but subtly shifting their positions, turning their empty skulls to follow his movements around the cave. Their jawbones worked silently as if they were trying to speak, and their bony fingers twitched and grasped at the air between them and the treasure. Thomas grabbed as much gold as he could carry and fled toward the cave entrance, his torch casting wild shadows as he ran. Behind him, the whispers rose to a crescendo, and he could hear what sounded like bones rattling against stone. But when he reached the mouth of the cave and turned back, torch held high, everything was silent and still. The skeletons lay motionless in their circle, and only the echo of his own breathing filled the underground chamber. Telling himself he had imagined the whole thing, Thomas emerged into the late afternoon sunlight and loaded his initial haul onto the pack horse. He had perhaps a third of the treasure, still more wealth than most men saw in a lifetime, but the knowledge that so much remained in the cave gnawed at him. He made camp just outside the natural amphitheater, planning to return the next morning for another load. That night was the longest of Thomas's life. The darkness beyond his campfire seemed alive with movement and whispered conversations in archaic Spanish. Several times he was certain he saw figures moving between the red stone formations, tall shapes that walked with the gait of living men, but cast no shadows in the firelight. His horses were nervous too, stamping and nickering at sounds only they could hear, their eyes rolling white with fear whenever they looked toward the cave entrance. Thomas dozed fitfully, jerking awake every few minutes with the feeling that someone was standing just behind him. Each time he spun around, he found nothing but empty darkness, but the feeling persisted. As dawn approached, he made a decision that surprised even himself. Rather than return to the cave for more treasure, he would take what he had and leave immediately. The gold in his saddlebags was enough to set him up comfortably anywhere, and every instinct he possessed was screaming at him to get away from this place as quickly as possible. But when morning came and Thomas tried to break camp, he discovered that leaving would not be as simple as he had hoped. During the night, something had happened to his horses. Both animals stood motionless, their heads hanging low, their eyes staring at nothing. They were alive but completely unresponsive, as if their minds had simply departed. No amount of coaxing, pulling, or even striking could make them move. Worse, when Thomas examined his saddlebags, he found that they were empty. Every gold coin, every piece of silver, every precious artifact he had removed from the cave had vanished without a trace. The leather bags showed no signs of having been cut or opened. There were no tracks around his campsite except his own, and he had been a light sleeper who would have awakened at the slightest sound. Standing in the red dust of the amphitheater, surrounded by towering stone walls that seemed to lean inward like the sides of a trap, Thomas began to understand that he was dealing with forces beyond his experience or comprehension. The treasure was protected by something that would not allow it to leave this place, something that had been guarding Diego's gold for over a century, and had no intention of letting its vigil end now. As this realization sank in, Thomas heard the sound of horses approaching from the direction of Broken Creek. A rescue party, perhaps. Or maybe just curious townspeople wondering what had happened to the stranger who had ridden out 3 days ago and failed to return. But when the riders appeared at the entrance to the amphitheater, Thomas discovered that his troubles were just beginning, because the men who rode toward his camp were not from Broken Creek at all, and they were very interested in what a lone prospector might have found in the Badlands south of town. The 3 riders who approached Thomas's camp were not the rescue party he might have hoped for. They were hard-looking men with the predatory demeanor of professional outlaws, their clothes dusty from long travel, and their weapons well-maintained and easily accessible. The leader was a lean, sharp-featured man with a carefully waxed mustache and cold blue eyes that missed nothing as they surveyed Thomas's campsite and the obviously distressed horses. "Morning," the leader called out with false friendliness as the trio reined in, their mounts about 20 yards away. Close enough for conversation, but far enough to avoid any sudden moves. "Name's Carson Pike. These are my associates, Mills and Garrett. We heard tell there was a fellow poking around these parts looking for something valuable. Thought we might offer our assistance?" Thomas recognized the type immediately. Claimed jumpers and road agents who made their living by following prospectors and treasure hunters into remote areas, then taking whatever they found. Under normal circumstances, he would have been confident in his ability to handle 3 men, even if they had the advantage of numbers. But his current situation was far from normal. With his horses incapacitated and his stolen treasure creating complications he couldn't explain. "Just doing some prospecting," Thomas replied carefully, his hand resting casually near his gun. "Haven't found much worth talking about. Ground's pretty barren in these parts." Pike's smile widened, but his eyes remained cold as winter ice. "Now that's funny, because we had ourselves a conversation with an old Mexican woman back in Broken Creek, seems." She was mighty concerned. About a stranger who'd come asking questions about Spanish, gold, and old treasure maps. Thomas felt his blood chill. If Maria had talked to these men, willingly or otherwise, then his situation was even more desperate than he had imagined. Pike continued, clearly enjoying the psychological advantage he held. Old woman spun quite a tale about lost conquistador treasure and ancient maps. Course, we weren't entirely sure we believed her until we tracked you out here to this interesting little formation. Seems like exactly the sort of place a smart fellow might hide something valuable. "Like I said, I haven't found anything," Thomas repeated, but Pike was no longer listening. His attention had been caught by the cave entrance partially hidden behind fallen rocks and scraggly brush. "Well now, what do we have here? Looks like Mother Nature provided herself a nice little vault, doesn't it, boys?" Mills and Garrett, who had remained silent during the exchange, now spread out to better cover the campsite while Pike dismounted and approached the cave opening. "I wouldn't go in there if I were you," Thomas called out, his warning driven more by genuine concern than any desire to protect the treasure. "Place has a bad feel to it. Something's not right about that cave." Pike laughed, a harsh sound that echoed off the red stone walls. "Only thing not right about it is that we're out here and the gold's in there. But we're about to fix that particular problem." Pike disappeared into the cave entrance, and Thomas could see the glow of his torch moving deeper into the underground chamber. For several minutes there was no sound except the nervous shifting of horses and the whisper of wind through the stone formations. Then Pike's voice echoed from within the cave, tight with excitement and greed. "Boys, you are not going to believe what's in here. We've hit the mother lode." But Pike's triumphant shout was followed by something else, a sound that made Thomas's skin crawl and caused Mills and Garrett to exchange nervous glances. It was the same whispered voices Thomas had heard the night before, speaking their warning in archaic Spanish, but now they seemed louder, more urgent, as if Pike's presence had stirred up forces that had been lying dormant. The temperature around the campsite began to drop noticeably, despite the morning sun, and both Mills and Garrett began looking around uneasily. "Pike!" Garrett called toward the cave. "You all right in there? We're hearing some strange sounds out here." But Pike's response, when it came, was strained and frightened in a way that didn't match his earlier confidence. "Something's wrong in here." Pike's voice echoed from the depths of the cave. "The bones. They're moving. And it's getting cold, real cold. I can see my breath, and there's something in the shadows that shouldn't be there." His voice grew more panicked. "I'm coming out. Something's very wrong with this place." But Pike never emerged from the cave. His torchlight disappeared deeper into the underground chamber, and his voice faded to nothing, leaving only the increasingly loud whispers in Spanish that seemed to come from the stone walls themselves. Mills and Garrett waited for perhaps 10 minutes, calling their leader's name and getting no response, before their nerve finally broke. "Hell with this," Mills declared, already backing his horse away from the cave entrance. "Whatever's in there got Pike, and I ain't going in after him." Garrett nodded agreement, his face pale with superstitious fear. "Let's get out of here. This whole place feels cursed." They wheeled their horses and rode hard toward the entrance of the amphitheater, leaving Thomas alone with his motionless animals, and the growing certainty that the forces protecting the treasure were more powerful and more deadly than he had imagined. But Thomas's ordeal was far from over. As the day progressed, his situation became increasingly desperate. His horses remained in their trance-like state, unresponsive to any stimulus. His water was running low, and the oppressive atmosphere of the place was wearing on his nerves. Most disturbing of all, he began to see figures moving in his peripheral vision, tall shapes that looked like Spanish soldiers in archaic armor, walking patrol around the perimeter of the amphitheater. That evening, as Thomas huddled by his campfire and tried to plan his next move, Maria Esperanza appeared at the edge of his camp as silently as a ghost. The old woman looked older and more frail than she had in town, as if the journey to this cursed place had drained something vital from her. But her dark eyes were as sharp as ever, and they held no surprise at finding Thomas in his current predicament. "I told you to be careful," Maria said simply, settling herself on a rock near the fire. "I warned you that the price of the treasure might be higher than its value." But men never listen to warnings when gold fever has them in its grip. Thomas stared at her in amazement. "How did you get here?" "How did you even know where I was?" Maria smiled sadly. "I've known about this place since I was a little girl. My great-grandmother brought me here once to show me where the Spanish soldiers died, and to teach me why some treasures should never be claimed. I've been having dreams about you since you left town, dreams that showed me you were in trouble, so I came as I knew I would have to eventually. Those outlaws, Pike and his men, they said they talked to you," Thomas accused. "They knew about the map, about the treasure." Maria nodded without shame. "They threatened to burn my house and hurt the people I care about if I didn't tell them what they wanted to know. But I only told them enough to get them to leave town. I didn't tell them about the real danger of this place, the guardian spirits that protect the treasure. That was for them to discover on their own." Thomas looked toward the cave entrance, thinking about Pike's fate. What exactly is guarding that gold? What happened to those men who died in there? Maria's expression grew distant, as if she were seeing events from long ago. When Diego hid the treasure, he did more than just put it in a cave. He made a bargain with the spirits of the dead, the soldiers who had died protecting it. He bound their souls to this place, making them eternal guardians of the gold. In return, the treasure would remain safe until someone worthy came to claim it. "Worthy?" Thomas asked. "What makes someone worthy?" Maria looked at him with something like pity. "Someone who doesn't want the gold for themselves. Someone who would use it to help others, to do good in the world." Diego thought such a person would eventually come, but in over a century, everyone who has found this place has come for selfish reasons. And so the guardians remain, and the treasure stays buried. As if summoned by their conversation, the whispered voices began again, echoing from the cave and the stone walls around the amphitheater. But this time, Thomas could understand some of the Spanish words, and what he heard chilled him more than the dropping temperature. The voices were discussing his fate, debating whether he should be allowed to leave or whether he should join Pike and the countless other treasure hunters who had disturbed their eternal vigil over the years. What do I do? Thomas asked desperately. How do I get out of this alive? Maria stood slowly, her old bones protesting the movement. There's only one way, she said quietly. You have to make the same choice Diego made. You have to give up your claim to the treasure willingly, and you have to promise to protect this secret for the rest of your life. The spirits might accept that bargain and let you go. Thomas felt his heart sink. After everything he had been through, after finding the greatest treasure in Texas history, he was being asked to walk away empty-handed. There has to be another way, he protested. I can't go back to my old life with nothing. I came here to start over, to escape what I was before. Maria studied his face in the firelight. What were you before, Thomas Hartwell? What are you running from? That's worse than the fate waiting for you in that cave. The question hung in the air between them, and Thomas realized that this old woman somehow knew more about him than should have been possible. I was a detective in Kansas, Thomas admitted quietly. A good one, or so I thought. But I got involved with some corrupt officials. Took money to look the other way on certain cases. Planted evidence when the guilty parties had enough influence to avoid justice otherwise. I told myself I was serving a higher justice, but really I was just serving my own greed and ambition. And when it all came to light? Maria prompted gently. When your corruption was exposed, what happened then? Thomas stared into the fire, remembering the disgrace, the newspaper headlines, the look of betrayal in the eyes of people who had trusted him. I lost everything. My job, my reputation, my friends. I came to Texas to disappear, to find enough money to start over somewhere no one knew my name. This treasure was supposed to be my redemption. Maria nodded with understanding. But redemption doesn't come from gold, Thomas. It comes from choosing to do what's right even when it costs you everything. Especially when it costs you everything. The spirits in that cave, they can see into men's souls. They know what kind of person you really are underneath the fear and the greed. The question is, what kind of person do you want to be? As if responding to their conversation, the temperature around the campsite dropped even further, and Thomas could see his breath forming clouds in the frigid air. The whispered voices grew louder and more insistent, and in the darkness beyond the firelight, he could make out the shapes of armored figures moving in a slow circle around their camp. The Spanish soldiers were closing in, and Thomas realized he was running out of time to make his choice. If I give up the treasure, Thomas asked, if I make this promise to protect the secret, what guarantee do I have that they'll let me live? Maria's expression was grave. No guarantee at all, but it's the only chance you have. The spirits have been betrayed too many times by treasure hunters who promised anything to escape, then returned with larger groups or sold the information to others. Your word would have to be backed by something more than just fear. What do you mean? Thomas asked, though he was beginning to suspect what the old woman was driving toward. You would have to stay, Maria said simply. Not here, not in this cursed place, but in this territory. You would have to make Texas your home, and you would have to prove your commitment to protecting this secret through your actions, not just your words. The proposition was staggering. Thomas had planned to take the treasure and disappear to California or Colorado, somewhere he could reinvent himself completely. But Maria was asking him to remain in Texas, to build a new life here while serving as a guardian of the secret he had uncovered. It meant giving up not just the gold, but his dreams of escape and anonymity. As Thomas wrestled with this decision, the ghostly soldiers drew closer, and he could see their faces clearly now in the firelight. They were not the skeletal remains he had seen in the cave, but the spirits of the men they had been in life, proud Spanish conquistadors who had died protecting their sacred trust. Their leader, a man who could only be Captain Morales himself, stepped forward and spoke in perfect English. Thomas Hartwell, the ghostly captain said, his voice carrying the authority of centuries. You have found our treasure and disturbed our rest. By rights, your soul should join ours in eternal guardianship of the gold. But this woman speaks for you, and she has some influence with us. We offer you the choice we offered Diego long ago. Serve willingly or be compelled to serve forever. What exactly does service mean? Thomas asked, surprised by his own courage in addressing the supernatural captain directly. What would be required of me? Captain Morales gestured toward the cave where his treasure lay hidden. You would return to the world of the living, but you would be bound to us by oath and spirit. You would ensure that no other treasure hunters find this place. You would discourage those who come seeking lost Spanish gold. And when your natural life ends, you would join our company here, adding your strength to our eternal watch. It was, Thomas realized, exactly the kind of bargain Diego had made over a century ago. The young Spanish soldier had survived the Comanche attack and hidden the treasure, but he had paid for that survival with his freedom, spending his remaining years as a living guardian of the secret, and when he died, his spirit had joined those of his fallen comrades in their supernatural vigil. "I need time to think," Thomas said, but Captain Morales shook his head. "Dawn approaches and our power wanes with the sunrise. You must choose now, while we have the strength to honor whatever bargain we make. Accept our terms and live, bound to our service but free to make a new life in the world above. Refuse, and join us immediately in death and eternal guardianship." Thomas looked at Maria, searching her weathered face for guidance, but the old woman simply nodded toward the ghostly captain. The choice was his alone to make. He could accept a life of service and responsibility, giving up his dreams of wealth and anonymity, or he could refuse and face immediate death in the cursed cave. In that moment, Thomas thought about his life before Texas, about the corruption that had destroyed his career and reputation in Kansas. He had told himself he was serving justice, but really he had been serving his own interests, just as he had been when he came seeking Diego's treasure. Perhaps this was his chance for real redemption, not through gold but through genuine service to something greater than himself. "I accept your terms," Thomas said quietly. "I'll guard your secret and discourage others from seeking your treasure. I'll make Texas my home and prove my word through my actions." Captain Morales nodded approvingly, and the other ghostly soldiers stepped back into the shadows. "Then it is agreed. You are bound to us now, Thomas Hartwell, but you are also free to return to the world of the living." As the sun began to rise over the red stone formations, the ghostly soldiers faded like mist, and the oppressive cold lifted from the amphitheater. Thomas's horses stirred and shook themselves as if waking from a long dream, once again responsive to his commands. Maria smiled and began walking toward the entrance of the natural bowl, gesturing for him to follow. "Come," she said, "it's time to go home. There's work to be done, and you have a new life to build." As they rode out of the cursed place together, Thomas looked back once at the cave where Diego's treasure lay waiting for someone truly worthy to claim it. He realized now that worthiness had nothing to do with noble intentions or pure motives. It had to do with being willing to sacrifice everything for something more important than yourself. 3 weeks later, the people of Broken Creek were surprised to learn that the stranger who had ridden out to do some prospecting had decided to settle permanently in their community. Thomas Hartwell bought a small ranch outside of town, started a modest cattle operation, and gradually became known as one of the most reliable and honest men in the territory. He never spoke about what had happened during his 3 days in the Badlands, and when other treasure hunters came through asking about Spanish gold and lost conquistador hordes, he always managed to convince them that such stories were just legends with no basis in reality. Old Maria lived for another 7 years, and in her final days, she told Thomas that he had chosen well, that the spirits of the dead soldiers rested easier, knowing their trust was in good hands. When she died, Thomas was the one who prepared her for burial, and among her possessions he found the original leather map that Diego had drawn with his own hand. Thomas burned it that night, ensuring that the secret would die with Maria and that no other treasure hunters would be tempted by the lure of cursed gold. Thomas Hartwell lived to be an old man, respected in his community and known for his wisdom and integrity. He never married, never accumulated great wealth, but he found a peace that had eluded him during his years of corruption and greed. And when he died in 1923 at the age of 85, there were those who swore they saw a company of ghostly Spanish soldiers riding out to escort his soul to whatever reward awaited him beyond the veil of death. The cave in the Redstone Amphitheater remains hidden to this day, its treasure still waiting for someone worthy enough to claim it. But the spirits that guard it rest easier now, knowing that there are still those in the world willing to sacrifice personal gain for the greater good. And sometimes, on certain nights when the wind is right and the moon is dark, travelers in the Texas Badlands report seeing a lone rider moving through the desert, a man in modern clothes who watches over the ancient places where the dead keep their eternal vigil, over treasures too dangerous for the living to possess.